What's up, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Bulwark. In this episode, I want to talk about Latin. Why was Latin selected for the traditional Mass? And why is it that many people insist upon having Latin in the liturgy today? I mean, why not just use English? A language that everyone can understand. These are valid questions. So in this video, I do want to look at the historical reasons for Latin in the Mass, as well as the practical reasons. Now, before I get into that, I do want to address a comment that I received in one of my shorts. In that short, I did talk about the Latin Mass and the Latin language, and somebody commented this: "Dead language, dead religion. The saints did not speak Latin. Peter was not the first saint. Catholicism is a Roman hijacking of biblical Christianity. They made up a bunch of goofy rules unsanctioned by Christ. Catholicism is a religion, and God hates religion. Why? Because religion does not need God. All religion needs is more religion." Okay, so there is a lot to unpack in that comment, and I can't get to all of it. But, for starters, we have never claimed that Peter was the first saint. Also, we can demonstrate that God does not hate religion. And as for his goofy rules comment, well, that can be the subject of future videos. I do want to talk about what he says about Latin. Now, he said that the saints did not speak Latin, and that's not wholly true. There were many saints who spoke Latin. There were many who didn't, but many who were native Latin speakers. He also calls Latin a dead language, and that's actually true. Latin is dead, meaning that there are no more native speakers. Nobody grows up speaking Latin as their primary or their only language. It's only a language that somebody learns later in life. So in that sense, it is truly a dead language. So why do we use it in the Latin Mass? So let's look at the historical reasons. So if you go back to the early church, so I'm thinking the time of the apostles, so Peter and Andrew, James, John, etc. At that time, the apostles and the priests along with them were celebrating Mass in Greek. Even when Peter and Paul made their way up to Rome, they also said Mass in Greek. Now, Rome was a Latin-speaking city, and so over time, Latin got incorporated into the liturgy. Now, a quick caveat on that: this was different from what we might call street Latin. They would use slang terms and whatnot on the street. That was not appropriate for Mass. They would always use proper Latin and an elevated form of it. So that became the Roman tradition. And in the subsequent generations, each priest would say Mass the way that previous generations did. So they would take on the received tradition. And that just kept getting passed on down through the centuries. This even applied to non-Latin speaking communities. So there were certain areas that were evangelized by Latin speaking Christians. So think like England or Germany. Even in those places where they didn't speak Latin, they still had Mass in Latin. And so that was the tradition for centuries. So having Latin in the Mass is a way of respecting the received tradition. Worship is not what we make of it. It is what has been passed on to us. And there is a certain wisdom of our elders that we must respect. Now, there is also a practical reason for this. Latin being a dead language means that it never changes. English, because it is actively spoken, does change. Compare English to different generations. You can go back far enough to where you can't even understand English anymore. Well, that is a consequence of a language that is actively spoken. Words are constantly changing. Even the definition of words change. Think, for example, the word gay. If you go back 100 years, that word meant something very different from how it is used today. Now, for Latin, because it is no longer actively spoken, It is a language that does not change. The words do not change in meaning. They don't evolve. They always mean the same thing for all generations. And so for that reason, it's a great benefit. Also, we must understand that the Catholic Church is a global institution. The church is all over the world. It's in the United States, in England, in Italy, in France, in Kenya, in Vietnam, etc., with all these different people that speak very different languages. So the benefit of Latin is that we can come together and worship in the same language. This becomes very evident if you ever go to Mass with the Pope. Oftentimes he will say Mass in Latin, and the people that are gathered with him are a very diverse group of people. And one thing that unites us all in our worship is when we all use Latin. Or, if we have somebody who's on pilgrimage from the United States and he goes to Rome, well, if he's familiar with the Latin, he can go to a Latin Mass and it's the exact same as what he knows from back at home. And so there's also this familiarity with it all throughout the world. And we can also take solace in the fact that the Latin Mass is the same here as it is everywhere else in the world. And so it gives us this common language for a universal church. So these are just some of the reasons as to why Latin is a valuable thing to have in the liturgy. My name is Father Luger. Please like and subscribe. This has been The Bulwark.